Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open something fizzy, controversial, and honestly kind of ridiculous. The story of Coca-Cola, not the billion-dollar brand with polar bears and Christmas trucks. I mean the original recipe, the one that literally contained cocaine and made absolutely no apologies about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this sort of thing. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You clearly understand that the best history is the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your favourite soft drink. Your suggestions genuinely shape what we explore here, and I'm grateful for that. And hey, speaking of places to listen, the channel's now on Spotify too, so if you prefer falling asleep there, the link's in the description. Now dim those lights, maybe grab some water, ironically, turn on a fan for that soft white noise, and let's ease into tonight's carbonated journey together. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1886. You're thirsty. Your options are questionable well water that might contain cholera, warm beer that tastes like liquid bread, or a new medicinal tonic that promises to cure your headaches, calm your nerves, and give you a little pep in your step. What's in it? Oh, just some cocaine and a splash of wine. Refreshing. But here's the thing, nobody thought this was weird. In fact, they thought it was genius. This was the age of patent medicines, when you could walk into any pharmacy and buy a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for your teething baby, which, surprise, contained morphine. Cocaine was in everything. Toothache drops, headache powders, even hay fever remedies. It wasn't a scandal, it was Tuesday. So tonight we're diving deep into the strange, hilarious, and occasionally horrifying world of late 19th century America, where a pharmacist named John Pemberton decided to mix cocaine with cola nuts, call it medicine, and accidentally create the most recognizable brand on planet Earth. We'll explore how a Civil War injury led to morphine addiction, which led to cocaine experimentation, which led to, well, Coca-Cola. We'll talk about why cocaine was legal, how it became illegal, and why the company spent decades pretending their original recipe was just a fun misunderstanding. We'll meet the characters, the inventor who died broke, the businessman who bought the formula for pocket change, and the FDA agents who finally said, okay, maybe we should check what's actually in this stuff. Have you ever wondered what cocaine actually tastes like in a beverage? Did Coca-Cola's original drinkers know they were consuming drugs? Or did they just think they really, really liked soda? How did a drink that started as a morphine addiction cure become the most successful product in capitalism's history? Could you walk into an 1890s pharmacy and just order a cocaine cola? How many doses were in one bottle? And would you actually feel high or just think you had a lot of energy for no reason? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1886 Atlanta, Georgia. The air smells like horse manure and coal smoke. You're wearing a hat you didn't choose, shoes that hurt, and you're about to witness the birth of a beverage empire built on a drug that will be illegal in about 30 years. But right now, it's perfectly legal, widely celebrated, and served at soda fountains next to the church on Sunday. Good luck. Before there was Coca-Cola, there was John Stith Pemberton, a pharmacist with a limp, a morphine problem, and a laboratory full of questionable experiments. Born in Georgia in 1831, Pemberton had all the makings of a respectable Southern gentleman. Medical training, a pharmacy business, and a reputation for creating patent medicines that people actually bought. But the Civil War changed everything. Picture Pemberton in his Atlanta pharmacy around 1870. A bearded man in his late 30s standing over bubbling beakers and measuring out tinctures with the precision of someone who genuinely believes he's doing science. He's not a snake oil salesman, at least he doesn't think he is. He's a trained pharmacist, a Confederate veteran, and a man desperately trying to solve two problems at once: his own chronic pain and the question of how to make a living in a post-war South where everyone's broke and miserable. Pemberton's pharmacy was cluttered with the tools of his trade: glass bottles filled with mysterious liquids, mortar and pestles stained from grinding powders, and shelves lined with ingredients that would make a modern DEA agent weep: opium, morphine, chloroform, cannabis, and soon cocaine. This wasn't unusual. Every pharmacy looked like this. Medicine in the 19th century was less about understanding the human body and more about throwing substances at problems until something worked or the patient died. Often both. What set Pemberton apart wasn't his ethics or his medical knowledge, it was his ambition. He didn't just want to fill prescriptions, he wanted to invent something. Something that would sell. Something that would make him rich. He experimented constantly, mixing botanical extracts with alcohol, sweeteners, and whatever new ingredient had just arrived from Europe or South America. He called these concoctions patent medicines, though they were patented in marketing only. The formulas themselves were secrets, deliberately vague, impossible to verify. By the 1870s, Pemberton had already created several moderately successful products: Indian Queen hair dye, triplex liver pills, and something called extract of Stilingia, which claimed to cure blood disorders, scrofula, and general moral weakness. Did they work? Almost certainly not. Did people buy them? Absolutely. Because in an era before the FDA, before clinical trials, before anyone had the faintest idea what caused disease, hope was the only medicine that mattered. But Pemberton had a problem that his own medicines couldn't fix. That Civil War sabre wound had left him with nerve damage and constant pain, and his solution, morphine, had become its own nightmare. He was addicted, dependent on daily doses just to function. He tried to quit, tried to taper down, but withdrawal was agony. So he did what any enterprising pharmacist addict would do. He started experimenting with alternatives. Enter cocaine. In the early 1880s, this new drug from South America was being hailed as a miracle cure for morphine addiction. Doctors were prescribing it. Sigmund Freud was writing enthusiastic essays about it. It seemed like the perfect solution, a stimulant that could counteract morphine sedation, a painkiller that wasn't opium, a cure that came in a leaf. Pemberton was intrigued. He ordered coca leaves, he ground them into powder, he mixed them into syrups. And somewhere in that process, somewhere between desperation and inspiration, he started wondering, what if I could sell this? What if chronic pain and pharmaceutical desperation could become America's favourite beverage? Pemberton didn't know it yet, but he was about to invent something that would outlive him, outlast cocaine prohibition, and eventually reach every corner of the planet. But first, he'd need a war wound. In 1865, during one of the final cavalry skirmishes of the Civil War, Pemberton took a sabre slash across the chest. It wasn't fatal, but it was agonizing. And in the 1860s, there was exactly one solution for chronic pain: morphine. Lots and lots of morphine. Doctors handed it out like candy, soldiers became addicted by the thousands, and Pemberton was no exception. Imagine you're a Confederate officer in April 1865. The war is collapsing around you. Lee is about to surrender. Your side has lost. And in one of the war's final pointless skirmishes, a Union cavalryman's sabre catches you across the chest. The blade slices through your uniform, skin and muscle, leaving a wound that burns like fire and bleeds like a slaughterhouse. You're carried off the field, delirious, screaming, and then someone, a field surgeon, a fellow soldier, maybe just someone who looks like they know what they're doing, hands you a small brown bottle and says, "Drink this. It's morphine." Liquid morphine mixed with alcohol, probably labelled something reassuring like Mrs. Whitmore's soothing elixir or Dr. Hammond's nerve tonic. You drink it. The pain doesn't disappear, but it gets quieter, farther away, like it's happening to someone else in another room. You drink more the next day, and the day after that. And suddenly, 6 months have passed, you're back home in Georgia trying to rebuild your life, and you realise you can't stop. This was Pemberton's reality. The Civil War created an entire generation of morphine addicts, so many that the condition was nicknamed soldier's disease. Doctors prescribed it freely because they didn't understand addiction yet. They thought morphine was a miracle. It stopped pain, calmed nerves, and made shattered men functional again. What they didn't realise was that it rewired the brain, turned relief into dependency, and transformed medicine into a cage. Pemberton tried to function. He returned to his pharmacy, went back to mixing tinctures and filling prescriptions, but the pain never fully left, and neither did the morphine. Every day started with a dose, then another before bed. His hands shook without it, his stomach cramped, his mind fogged. He was a pharmacist who understood chemicals better than most people understood their own families, and yet he couldn't free himself. Worse, he was surrounded by the drug. Morphine sat on his shelves in neat glass bottles, labelled and legal, waiting for the next desperate customer. It would have been like trying to quit coffee while working in a Starbucks, except the coffee also caused agonising physical withdrawals and could kill you if you took too much. Pemberton was trapped in a prison built from his own profession. By the early 1880s, he'd been using morphine for nearly 2 decades. He was in his 50s now, worn down, desperate for a way out. And that's when the rumours started circulating through medical journals and pharmacy conferences. Cocaine, they said, could cure morphine addiction. It was a stimulant, a local anaesthetic, and apparently a miracle drug that could replace opiates without the dangerous side effects. Doctors in Europe were testing it. Sigmund Freud was championing it, and Pemberton, sitting in his Atlanta pharmacy, read these reports with the desperate hope of a drowning man spotting a lifeboat. He ordered coca leaves from South America. He experimented with extracts. He tried mixing cocaine with morphine to ease the withdrawal. He tried substituting one for the other. And somewhere in this chemical desperation, an idea began forming. Cocaine made him feel alert, energized, optimistic, the opposite of morphine's heavy fog. What if he could harness that feeling? What if he could bottle it, sell it, and help other people the way he wished someone could help him? Pemberton never fully quit morphine, but he did discover cocaine, and that discovery, born from a sabre wound and a desperate addiction, would accidentally create the world's most recognizable brand, all because one man couldn't escape his past. To understand how Coca-Cola happened, you have to understand the absolute circus that was 19th century medicine. This was the golden age of patent medicines, bottled concoctions sold as cure-alls for everything from female hysteria to tuberculosis. Most of them contained alcohol, opium, cocaine, or some combination of all three, and they were marketed with the confidence of a carnival barker and the ethics of a con artist. Walk into any American pharmacy in 1880, and you'd be greeted by a wall of bottles, each one making promises that range from optimistic to completely insane. Dr. Kilmer's swamp root claimed to cure kidney disease, bladder problems, and nervous exhaustion. Ayer's cherry pectoral would supposedly heal your lungs, calm your cough, and strengthen your constitution. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was marketed specifically to women, promising relief from menstrual cramps, menopause, and the general burden of existing in a female body, and yes, it was 18% alcohol. These medicines weren't regulated. There were no ingredient labels, no clinical trials, no FDA inspectors showing up to ask awkward questions like, does this actually work? Or, how much cocaine is in here exactly? Companies could put whatever they wanted in a bottle, call it medicine, and sell it to desperate people who had nowhere else to turn. Because here's the thing, actual medicine barely existed. Doctors in the 1880s didn't understand germ theory yet. They still believed in miasmas, bad air that caused disease. Surgery was done without anesthesia or sterilization, meaning you were more likely to die from the operation than the problem it was supposed to fix. So when you got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that kept you in bed for weeks, you didn't have many options. You could pray, which was free but rarely effective. You could see a doctor who might bleed you with leeches or prescribe mercury, which would definitely make things worse. Or you could go to the pharmacy and buy a bottle of something that promised to help. And if that bottle happened to contain alcohol, opium, or cocaine, well, at least you'd feel better temporarily. The marketing was shameless. Patent medicine ads filled newspapers with testimonials from people who'd been miraculously cured after taking the product. These testimonials were almost always fake, written by copywriters who'd never met the supposed patients. But they worked because people were desperate, and desperation makes you believe anything. One ad for cocaine toothache drops featured a cheerful illustration of children playing, with the text, "Instantaneous cure, price 15 cents. Yes, you could buy cocaine drops for your toddler's teething pain, and it was considered responsible parenting. The most successful patent medicines were the ones that made you feel different immediately. Alcohol made you warm and relaxed. Opium made pain dissolve into dreamy fog. Cocaine made you alert and confident. These effects had nothing to do with curing disease, but they felt like medicine was working. You'd drink a bottle of Dr. Hartman's Peruna, 28-parent alcohol marketed as a cough syrup, and suddenly your cough didn't bother you as much, not because the cough was gone, but because you were drunk. Pemberton understood this game better than most. He knew that for a medicine to sell, it had to make people feel something quickly. A slow-acting cure was worthless. An instant buzz was priceless. So when he started developing his own patent medicines in the 1870s and 1880s, he focused on formulas that delivered immediate effects, stimulation, pain relief, and that vague sense of well-being that made customers come back for more. This was the world that birthed Coca-Cola, an unregulated pharmaceutical free-for-all where cocaine was legal, addiction was misunderstood, and the line between medicine and recreational drug hadn't been invented yet. Pemberton wasn't a criminal. He was just playing by the rules of his time. The problem was those rules were about to change. In the 1880s, cocaine wasn't a scandal. It was a sensation. Extracted from coca leaves native to South America, cocaine had just hit the American and European markets, and doctors were absolutely losing their minds over it. It was being used as a local anesthetic, a cure for depression, a treatment for asthma, and a pick-me-up for anyone feeling sluggish. Picture yourself in 1884 reading the latest medical journals. You're a physician, a pharmacist, or just someone interested in the cutting edge of science. And everywhere you look, cocaine is being celebrated as a miracle. Surgeons are using it to numb patients' eyes before operating. The first time in history that eye surgery doesn't require someone to physically hold the screaming patient down. Dentists are injecting it into gums before pulling teeth. Psychiatrists are prescribing it for melancholy, fatigue, and what they vaguely call neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis that basically means you seem tired and sad. The excitement wasn't just hype. Cocaine genuinely worked, at least it seemed to work. When you took cocaine, you felt different immediately. Energy surged through your body. Your mood lifted, pain faded, exhaustion vanished. If you'd been dragging through life feeling foggy and depressed, cocaine made you feel sharp, confident, and capable again. It was like someone had turned on a light switch inside your brain, and unlike morphine or alcohol, which made you sleepy and slow, cocaine made you productive. You could work longer, think faster, and function better. Or so it seemed. The most famous early champion of cocaine was Sigmund Freud. Yes, that Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, the man who would later theorize about the unconscious mind and childhood trauma. But in 1884, Freud was just a young, ambitious neurologist looking for a breakthrough. He started experimenting with cocaine on himself, and he was thrilled by the results. He wrote a glowing essay called Über Coca, on coca, in which he praised cocaine as a cure for depression, digestive problems, and morphine addiction. He even sent some to his fiancée, telling her it would make her stronger and prettier. He wasn't joking. Freud recommended cocaine to his friends and patients. One of his close friends, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, was addicted to morphine after a painful injury. Freud convinced him to try cocaine as a substitute, believing it would free him from opiates without causing addiction. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Fleischl-Marxow became addicted to cocaine instead, eventually consuming massive doses and suffering from psychosis, hallucinations, and what witnesses described as cocaine bugs, the sensation of insects crawling under his skin. He died a few years later, and Freud quietly stopped promoting cocaine. But by then, the drug had already spread across Europe and America like wildfire. Pharmaceutical companies jumped on the trend. Park Davis, one of America's largest drug manufacturers, began mass-producing cocaine in the 1880s. They marketed it in multiple forms: powders, tablets, injections, and even coca leaf cigarettes, which were advertised as treatments for asthma and hay fever. Their ads claimed cocaine could supply the place of food, make the coward brave, and the silent eloquent. It was sold over the counter, no prescription needed. You could walk into any pharmacy and buy it as casually as aspirin, and people did. Cocaine became fashionable. The wealthy used it recreationally at parties. Artists and writers used it to fuel creative bursts. Workers used it to stay alert during long shifts. Mothers gave it to teething babies. And pharmacists like Pemberton started adding it to their tonics, elixirs, and beverages, because cocaine made everything better, or at least it made everything feel better temporarily. But here's the thing nobody understood yet. Cocaine was addictive, deeply, powerfully, destructively addictive. The initial euphoria was real, but it didn't last. The more you used, the more you needed just to feel normal. And when you tried to stop, your brain punished you with crushing depression, exhaustion, and cravings that felt impossible to resist. The wonder drug of the 1880s was setting up a public health disaster, and nobody saw it coming, except maybe the people who started noticing they couldn't stop. But by then, it was too late. Cocaine was everywhere, including in a certain new beverage being sold at soda fountains across Atlanta. Pemberton's first big idea wasn't Coca-Cola. It was something called Pemberton's French Wine Coca, a beverage inspired by a wildly popular European drink called Vin Mariani. Vin Mariani was a Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves, and it was the drink of choice for popes, presidents, and poets. It promised to restore health, strength, energy, and vitality. Imagine you're John Pemberton in 1884, sitting in your Atlanta pharmacy, reading about Vin Mariani in imported medical journals. This French beverage is everywhere in Europe. Celebrities are endorsing it, doctors are prescribing it, and the inventor, Angelo Mariani, is getting rich. Pope Leo XIII supposedly carries a flask of it and has even awarded Mariani a gold medal. Queen Victoria drinks it. Thomas Edison drinks it. Ulysses S. Grant drank it during his final days while writing his memoirs, claiming it gave him the strength to finish before cancer took him. And you think, I can make that. I can make it better. I can make it American. So you do. You start with a base of cheap wine, not Bordeaux, because this is Georgia, not France, but something local and affordable. Then you add coca leaf extract, the same stuff that's making Vin Mariani famous. You throw in cola nut extract for extra caffeine and a bitter edge. You add damiana, an herb rumoured to be an aphrodisiac, because why not promise customers energy and virility? You sweeten it with sugar, flavour it with fruit extracts, and bottle it under the name Pemberton's French Wine Coca. The marketing writes itself. You advertise it as a nerve tonic and intellectual beverage that cures headaches, relieves exhaustion, and calms anxiety. You claim it's perfect for scientists, scholars, poets, divines, lawyers, physicians, and others devoted to extreme mental exertion. You don't mention the cocaine explicitly, that would be vulgar, but you make it very clear that this drink will make you feel better, work harder, and live longer. And people believe you because in 1884, everyone believes everything. French Wine Coca is a hit. You're selling bottles as fast as you can make them. Customers return week after week, saying it's the best thing they've ever tasted, that it gives them energy, that it helps them focus. They don't know they're developing a mild dependence on the cocaine and alcohol. They just know they like how it makes them feel. And you like how it makes your bank account feel. For the first time in years, you're making real money. You're not rich, but you're not broke. You've created something people want. Something that works, sort of. But there's a problem brewing, and it's not medical or chemical. It's moral. A growing temperance movement is sweeping through the South, and it's targeting alcohol with the fury of a tent revival preacher. Churches are organising boycotts. Women are marching in the streets. Local politicians are passing prohibition laws. And in 1885, Atlanta decides to go dry. Alcohol sales are banned within city limits. Overnight, your best-selling product becomes illegal. You could panic. You could move your business to a different city. You could give up and go back to filling prescriptions for cough syrup and stomach powders. But you don't. Because you're John Pemberton, and you've spent the last 20 years mixing chemicals in brass kettles, and you've never given up on anything except sobriety. So you look at your formula for French Wine Coca and think, what if I just remove the wine? What if you keep the cocaine, keep the cola nuts, keep the caffeine and the sweetness and the promise of energy? What if you make it non-alcoholic so it's legal under prohibition? What if you market it as a temperance drink, a healthy alternative to booze? What if you add carbonated water to make it fizzy and refreshing? Something people can drink on a hot Georgia afternoon without getting drunk, or at least without getting drunk on alcohol? The idea is brilliant. Desperate, yes, but brilliant. You go back to your laboratory, you start over, you remove the wine, adjust the flavours, increase the coca extract slightly to compensate for the missing alcohol kick, and create a syrup designed to be mixed with soda water at drugstore fountains. You need a name, something catchy, something that hints at the ingredients without being too medical. Your bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggests Coca-Cola. It's simple. It's alliterative. It clearly references the coca leaves and cola nuts. Perfect. You don't know it yet, but you've just invented the future. French wine. Coca was a success, but Coca-Cola will become something else entirely. A global empire, a cultural icon, and a beverage that will outlive everyone involved in its creation. But first, you have to sell it. And it's 1886, and you're broke, addicted, and running out of time. Just as Pemberton's French Wine Coca was gaining traction, Atlanta dropped a bombshell. The city went dry. Prohibition arrived early in parts of the South, and suddenly, Pemberton's wine-based tonic was illegal. He could have given up. He could have moved. Instead, he did what any desperate pharmacist would do. He removed the wine and doubled down on everything else. The temperance movement didn't arrive quietly. It marched through southern towns like an army of angry mothers armed with Bibles and hand-painted signs. These women, because it was mostly women, had watched their husbands, sons and brothers drink themselves into poverty, violence and early graves. They'd had enough. They organised boycotts, staged protests, and pressured politicians to ban alcohol. And in 1885 they won in Atlanta. The city council passed a prohibition ordinance that banned the sale of alcoholic beverages within city limits. You're Pemberton, and you've just watched your best-selling product become illegal overnight. French wine Coca's entire appeal was built on wine, that's literally in the name. The alcohol made it smooth, gave it body, and delivered an immediate warming sensation that customers associated with the medicine working. Without it, you're selling what? Cocaine-flavoured water? That's not going to work. Or is it? Here's where Pemberton's desperation meets his genius. Instead of seeing prohibition as a death sentence, he sees it as a marketing opportunity. The temperance crowd isn't anti-medicine, they're anti-alcohol. They're not opposed to people feeling better, they're opposed to drunkenness, violence, and moral decay. So what if you create a beverage that delivers the same energy, the same relief, the same buzz, but without the booze? What if you position it as the temperance alternative, the drink that good Christian women can serve at church socials without guilt? You go back to your laboratory, really just a kettle in your backyard because you're not exactly running a pharmaceutical empire here. You take your French wine Coca formula and start subtracting. Out goes the wine. Out goes the Damiana because that aphrodisiac marketing doesn't play well with the church crowd. But you keep the coca leaves, you keep the cola nuts, you keep the sugar, the caramel colouring and the fruit oils. And then you add something new. Carbonation. Carbonated water was trendy in the 1880s. Soda fountains were popping up in pharmacies across America, serving fizzy drinks that were considered medicinal because the carbonation supposedly aided digestion. People loved the tickle, the bubbles, the way it felt refreshing on a hot day. So you design your new formula to be mixed at soda fountains, 5 parts carbonated water to 1 part syrup. The bubbles mask some of the bitterness from the Coca and Cola. The fizz makes it feel lighter, more playful, less medicinal. It's not wine, but it's something. You test it on friends, family, and a few brave pharmacy customers. The reactions are mixed. Some people love it. They say it's refreshing, energizing, perfect for hot afternoons. Others wrinkle their noses and say it tastes like medicine, which, to be fair, it kind of does. But here's the thing, it makes them feel good. After drinking a glass, people report feeling more alert, more focused, less tired. They can't quite put their finger on why, but they want another glass tomorrow. That's the cocaine and caffeine working their magic, though nobody's using those words yet. You need a name, and your bookkeeper Frank Robinson suggests Coca-Cola. It's perfect, alliterative, memorable, and honest about the ingredients without being too technical. Robinson even designs a logo in his flowing Spencerian script, the fancy cursive handwriting that's popular for formal documents and advertisements. It looks elegant, trustworthy, like something a respectable business would sell. Which is exactly the image you need, because you're about to market cocaine to church ladies and call it a temperance drink. The pivot isn't seamless. You lose some of your wine-loving customers who preferred the old formula. But you gain something more valuable, respectability. Without the alcohol, Coca-Cola can be sold anywhere, consumed by anyone, and marketed as wholesome family refreshment. It's the perfect drink for an era obsessed with moral purity and terrified of vice. It doesn't make you drunk, it doesn't make you violent, it just makes you feel better. And in 1886 Atlanta, feeling better is worth 5 cents a glass. Prohibition didn't ruin Pemberton. It forced him to invent something that could survive in a world increasingly suspicious of pleasure. He removed the wine, kept the cocaine, and accidentally created a formula that would outlast every prohibition, every moral panic, and every social movement for the next 100+ years. All because some angry mothers decided booze was the enemy. If only they'd known what was really in that innocent-looking glass of cola. In 1886, in a brass kettle in his backyard, John Pemberton stirred together what would become the most famous beverage in human history. He called it Coca-Cola, a name that clearly referenced its 2 main ingredients: coca leaves, cocaine, and cola nuts, caffeine. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't trying to be. The exact date is disputed, some say May 8th, others claim earlier, but somewhere in the spring of 1886 Pemberton finished his formula. It wasn't a single eureka moment. It was weeks of trial and error, adjusting proportions, testing combinations, tasting batches that were too bitter, too sweet, too medicinal, or just wrong. He was working in his backyard because his laboratory was essentially a shed with a kettle, some measuring cups, and dreams of solvency. This wasn't a gleaming pharmaceutical facility. It was one step above cooking meth in a camper van. The formula itself was deceptively simple. Sugar water as the base, flavoured with extracts of coca leaves, cola nuts, vanilla, cinnamon, citrus oils, and a few other ingredients Pemberton kept deliberately vague. The coca leaves were imported from South America, Peru and Bolivia, mostly, and they contained naturally occurring cocaine. Not pure pharmaceutical-grade cocaine, but crude coca extract that still packed a noticeable punch. The cola nuts came from West Africa and contributed caffeine, plus a bitter, slightly astringent flavour that balanced the sweetness. Pemberton cooked the mixture in that brass kettle, stirring with a large wooden paddle, watching the ingredients dissolve into a thick, dark syrup that looked almost black in certain light. The smell was strange, sweet but medicinal, fruity but chemical, pleasant but slightly unsettling. It didn't smell like modern Coca-Cola, which has been refined and perfected over more than a century. This smelled like a pharmacy experiment, which is exactly what it was. Once the syrup was ready, it had to be mixed with carbonated water. You couldn't just add soda water to the kettle, the carbonation would escape immediately. The syrup was designed to be stored in bottles and mixed fresh at soda fountains, where pharmacists or soda jerks would measure out about an ounce of syrup, add 5 ounces of cold carbonated water, stir briefly, and serve it in a glass. The proportions were crucial. Too much syrup and it was overwhelmingly sweet and medicinal. Too little and it tasted like slightly flavoured fizzy water. Get it right, and you had something that tasted like nothing else on the market. The name Coca-Cola was brilliant marketing, even if Pemberton didn't fully realise it yet. In an era when most patent medicines had elaborate, forgettable names like Dr. Kilmer's swamp root kidney liver and bladder cure, something simple and catchy stood out. The double alliteration made it easy to remember and fun to say. And the name itself told customers exactly what was in the bottle, or at least 2 of the main ingredients. It was honest advertising, which was rare in the patent medicine world, where honesty was usually a liability. Pemberton's plan was to sell Coca-Cola through soda fountains, which were becoming fixtures in American pharmacies. These weren't just places to get carbonated drinks, they were social hubs, somewhere between a coffee shop and a bar, where people gathered to chat, cool off, and try the latest medicinal tonics. Soda fountains had elaborate marble counters, gleaming brass fixtures, and uniformed attendants who mixed drinks with theatrical flair. Selling through fountains meant Pemberton didn't need to bottle and distribute the product himself, he just had to convince pharmacy owners to stock his syrup. The first batch was ready by late April or early May of 1886. Pemberton carefully poured the syrup into bottles, labelled them with handwritten tags, and prepared to introduce Coca-Cola to the world. He had no idea if it would sell. He had no idea if anyone would like it. He just knew he'd created something different, something energizing, something that made people feel alert and optimistic and slightly buzzy in a way they couldn't quite explain. He'd bottled hope, mixed it with cocaine, and carbonated it. On a warm spring day in May, 1886, Pemberton walked into Jacob's Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta carrying bottles of his new syrup. He was nervous, broke, and desperate for this to work. He needed money. He needed success. He needed something to justify the years of experimentation and the morphine habit he still couldn't shake. He handed the pharmacist a bottle, explained the mixing proportions, and waited while the first glass of Coca-Cola was poured. Someone took a sip, then another, and then, somehow, history began. So what exactly was in that first batch of Coca-Cola? The formula was, and still is, one of the most guarded secrets in corporate history. But we know some things. The base was sugar water, flavoured with oils of orange, lemon, nutmeg, cinnamon and coriander. Then came the coca leaf extract. Pure, unprocessed, cocaine-included coca. Let's break this down ingredient by ingredient, because the devil, or in this case, the cocaine, is in the details. The syrup started with sugar and not a small amount. Pemberton used roughly 2 pounds of sugar per gallon of syrup, creating something thick, sweet, and almost medicinal in its intensity. This wasn't modern high-fructose corn syrup, it was straight cane sugar, probably purchased from local suppliers, boiled until it dissolved completely into the base liquid. Next came the flavouring oils. These were concentrated essences extracted from citrus peels, spices and herbs. A few drops went a long way. Orange oil added brightness. Lemon oil contributed tartness. Nutmeg added warmth. Cinnamon gave depth. Coriander, yes, the stuff you find in curry, added a subtle, slightly floral complexity that most people couldn't identify but definitely noticed. These oils were expensive, imported from around the world, and required precise measurement. Too much and the drink tasted like perfume. Too little, and it was just sweet brown water. Then came the coca leaves. Pemberton used what was called coca extract or fluid extract of coca, which was made by soaking dried coca leaves in alcohol to pull out the active compounds, primarily cocaine, but also dozens of other alkaloids and plant chemicals. The extract was dark, bitter, and potent. Pemberton added it directly to the syrup, and the amount varied depending on the strength of the leaves and his mood that particular day. There was no standardized measurement. He wasn't running a pharmaceutical lab with precision scales. He was eyeballing it. The cola nut extract came next. Cola nuts, imported from West Africa, were prized for their caffeine content, about 2% caffeine by weight, similar to coffee beans. The extract was made the same way as the coca extract. Dried nuts soaked in alcohol until the caffeine and flavouring compounds dissolved. The result was intensely bitter, which is why Pemberton added so much sugar. Without it, Coca-Cola would have tasted like chewing on a tree bark smoothie. The cola nuts also contributed tannins, those mouth-drying compounds you get from strong tea or red wine, which gave Coca-Cola a slight astringency that balanced the sweetness. Pemberton also threw in vanilla extract, which softened the harsh edges and added a creamy, comforting note. He used caramel colouring, burnt sugar, essentially, to give the syrup its distinctive dark brown appearance. Without it, Coca-Cola would have been pale amber, almost tea-like, which didn't look medicinal or impressive enough for marketing purposes. Some accounts mention other ingredients: lime juice for acidity, phosphoric acid to add tang, and possibly small amounts of alcohol left over from the extraction process. The exact formula varied slightly from batch to batch because Pemberton was mixing by hand without modern quality control. One batch might be slightly more bitter, another might be sweeter. Consistency wasn't the priority. Getting it to market was. What's fascinating is what wasn't in the original formula. No artificial flavours, no preservatives, no stabilizers. Everything was natural, which sounds impressive until you remember that natural includes cocaine. The syrup was also unstable. Without refrigeration, it could ferment, separate, or develop off flavors within weeks. Pemberton and early bottlers had to keep batches small and fresh, which limited production but ensured quality, or at least ensured that customers were drinking recently made cocaine syrup rather than old cocaine syrup. The final product, when mixed 5-to-1 with carbonated water at a soda fountain, was dark, fizzy, sweet, slightly bitter, and energizing in a way that made people want another glass. The cocaine gave it a subtle numbing sensation on the tongue and throat, followed by a mild euphoric lift. The caffeine added alertness. The sugar provided quick energy. Together, these ingredients created a beverage that felt medicinal, but tasted like a treat. It was Pemberton's masterpiece, a drink that delivered pleasure disguised as health. But here's the catch. Pemberton never wrote down the complete formula. He kept it in his head, paranoid that someone would steal it. He mixed batches himself or supervised closely. And when he eventually started selling shares of the formula to pay his bills, he created confusion about who actually owned what. Multiple people claimed to have the real recipe, and legal battles over ownership would drag on for years. The secret formula wasn't just a marketing gimmick, it was a genuine mess, one that nearly destroyed Coca-Cola before it even got started. Here's the question everyone wants answered. How much cocaine was actually in a bottle of Coca-Cola? The answer is complicated. Early analyses suggest each fluid ounce of Coca-Cola syrup contained approximately 9 milligrams of cocaine. When mixed with carbonated water at the soda fountain, the standard 5-to-1 ratio, a single glass contained roughly 1.8 milligrams. Let's put that in perspective, because numbers without context are meaningless. 1.8 milligrams of cocaine is a tiny amount, about the weight of a single grain of sand. For comparison, a typical recreational dose of cocaine today is 50 to 100 milligrams, snorted or injected for maximum effect. So a glass of Coca-Cola contained roughly 1/50th of a recreational dose. You'd have to drink 25 to 50 glasses in a rapid succession to get the kind of high people associate with cocaine abuse. And by that point, you'd probably be more worried about the sugar coma or the fact that your stomach was about to explode. But here's the thing. The cocaine in Coca-Cola wasn't meant to get you high. It was meant to give you a subtle lift, a gentle stimulation that enhanced your mood without making you obviously intoxicated. Think of it like the difference between drinking a single espresso versus doing a shot of pure caffeine extract. The espresso wakes you up, makes you feel good, and doesn't cause immediate problems. The pure extract makes your heart race and your hands shake. Pemberton was aiming for the espresso effect. Also, the cocaine in Coca-Cola was delivered orally, which matters more than you might think. When you snort cocaine, it hits your bloodstream almost instantly through the nasal membranes, producing a fast, intense high. When you drink it, it has to pass through your stomach and liver first, which breaks down some of the cocaine before it even reaches your brain. This is called first-pass metabolism, and it significantly reduces the drug's potency. So that 1.8 milligrams was probably closer to 1 milligram by the time it actually affected your nervous system. Still, 1 milligram was enough to do something. Regular Coca-Cola drinkers in the 1880s and 90s reported feeling more energetic, more focused, and in better spirits after a glass. They didn't describe it as getting high, they described it as feeling restored or invigorated, which was exactly what Pemberton promised in his advertising. The cocaine was working as intended, a mild stimulant that made life feel slightly more manageable. The problem was tolerance. If you drank Coca-Cola every day, which many people did because it was marketed as a health tonic, your body adapted to the cocaine. The initial lift diminished. You needed more to get the same effect, and while the amount in each glass was too small to cause dramatic addiction, daily consumption over months or years could absolutely lead to psychological dependence. You might not realize you were addicted to the cocaine specifically, but you definitely noticed that you felt worse on days when you didn't have your Coca-Cola. There's also the question of variability. Pemberton mixed batches by hand, and the cocaine content probably fluctuated wildly, depending on the quality of the coca leaves, how much extract he added, and whether he was having a good day or a morphine-fogged day. Some batches might have contained 3 milligrams per glass, others might have had barely 1. There was no quality control, no standardized testing, no FDA inspectors checking his work. If a customer complained that this batch didn't work as well as the last, Pemberton would just shrug and promise the next one would be better. We also know that Coca-Cola's cocaine content decreased over time, even before prohibition and regulation forced the issue. By the late 1890s, the company was using spent coca leaves that had already been processed to extract most of their cocaine for pharmaceutical use. These leaves still contained trace amounts, maybe 0.5 milligrams per glass instead of 2, but that was enough to legally claim the beverage still contained coca extract, while minimizing the stimulant effect. So yes, original Coca-Cola contained cocaine. No, it wasn't enough to get you dramatically high, but yes, it was enough to matter, to create a subtle dependence, and to help explain why Coca-Cola became so phenomenally popular so quickly. People weren't just drinking it because it tasted good, they were drinking it because it made them feel good. And when something makes you feel good every single day, you stop questioning why. On May 8th, 1886, Coca-Cola was sold for the first time at Jacob's Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta. The price? 5 cents per glass. The marketing? Delicious and refreshing. The truth? It was a slightly bitter, fizzy beverage that tasted vaguely medicinal and gave you a noticeable buzz if you drank enough of it. Picture the scene. Jacob's Pharmacy on a warm Atlanta afternoon. The pharmacy is located on Peachtree Street, a busy commercial strip lined with shops, offices, and the occasional horse-drawn carriage clattering past. Inside, the pharmacy is cool, dimly lit, and smells like a mixture of camphor, alcohol, and something vaguely floral from the perfume counter. At the back of the store is the soda fountain, a marble counter with brass fixtures, glass containers filled with colourful syrups, and a lever for dispensing carbonated water. John Pemberton walks in carrying a bottle of his new syrup. He's nervous, though he's trying not to show it. He's invested what little money he has into this formula, and if it doesn't sell, he's out of options. He approaches the pharmacist, some accounts say it was Willis Venable, others say it was someone else entirely, and explains what he's got. A new medicinal tonic, non-alcoholic, energizing, perfect for hot weather. The pharmacist is skeptical but willing to try. Pemberton probably offered the first batch for free or at a steep discount, just to get it into the fountain and in front of customers. The first glass is mixed, 1 ounce of dark brown syrup, 5 ounces of cold carbonated water, a quick stir, and there it is, the first Coca-Cola ever served. Who drank it first? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe it was a regular customer, someone stopping by for their daily headache powder or stomach tonic. Maybe it was Pemberton himself, nervously taste testing to make sure it was mixed properly. Whoever it was, they took a sip, paused, and probably thought, "This is different." It didn't taste like anything else on the market. It wasn't purely medicinal like most pharmacy tonics, which tasted deliberately bad to signal they were serious medicine. But it also wasn't purely recreational like the sweet fruit-flavoured sodas that were becoming popular at fountains. It was somewhere in between, sweet but slightly bitter, refreshing but with an edge, fizzy but with a lingering aftertaste you couldn't quite identify. That aftertaste was the Coca and Cola. The slight numbing sensation was the cocaine. The price, 5 cents, was carefully chosen. It was cheap enough that almost anyone could afford it, but expensive enough to signal quality. For context, 5 cents in 1886 had the purchasing power of about $1.50 today. You could buy a loaf of bread for 5 cents, or a newspaper, or a beer at a working-class saloon. So Coca-Cola wasn't positioned as a luxury item for the rich. It was an everyday indulgence for the middle class, something you could buy on a whim without feeling guilty. That first day, Pemberton sold 9 glasses. 9. Not 90, not 900, 9 glasses, bringing in a total of 45 cents. It was not an auspicious start. Pemberton had spent $50 on advertising and ingredients, so he was deeply in the red. But those 9 customers were the beginning. Some of them came back the next day, and the day after that. Word started spreading, slowly at first, through the small network of people who frequented downtown pharmacies. The early marketing was simple and direct. Pemberton and his partner Frank Robinson placed ads in the Atlanta Journal newspaper with headlines like Coca-Cola, delicious, refreshing, exhilarating, invigorating. They printed handbills and distributed them to businesses around the city. They offered free samples at the soda fountain to lure in hesitant customers, and they positioned Coca-Cola as a brain tonic, something that would help you think clearly, work harder, and feel better in the oppressive southern heat. The first year was rough. Pemberton sold about 25 gallons of syrup total, bringing in revenue of around $50. He'd spent more than twice that on production and advertising. By any business metric, Coca-Cola was a failure. But Pemberton believed in the formula. He believed people would keep coming back once they tried it, that the subtle stimulation from the cocaine and caffeine would create repeat customers who couldn't quite explain why they craved another glass. He was right, but he wouldn't live to see it. That first sale, 9 glasses at 5 cents each, 45 cents in total, barely enough to buy lunch, was the humble, almost pathetic beginning of something that would eventually generate billions of dollars in annual revenue. But on that May afternoon in 1886, John Pemberton just needed to sell enough syrup to afford his next dose of morphine. The empire would have to wait. Here's the thing about selling cocaine-laced beverages in the 1880s. You didn't have to hide it. You just had to call it medicine, and Pemberton was brilliant at this. Early Coca-Cola advertisements didn't shy away from the formula, they celebrated it. Coca-Cola. The temperance drink, one ad proclaimed, positioning it as a healthy alternative to alcohol. You're living in 1887 Atlanta, and you pick up the morning newspaper with your coffee, or more likely with your weak tea, because coffee is expensive and you're not rich. Buried between ads for corsets and farm equipment is a quarter-page spread for Coca-Cola. The headline reads, Coca-Cola, the wonderful nerve and brain tonic and remarkable therapeutic agent. There's an illustration of a well-dressed woman looking refreshed and energetic, holding a glass of something dark and fizzy. The text promises that Coca-Cola will cure your headaches, relieve mental and physical exhaustion, and restore your vitality after a long day. Notice what the ad doesn't say. This will get you high. It doesn't mention recreation, pleasure, or fun. It talks about therapeutic benefits, medical properties, and restoration of health. This is crucial. In the 1880s, recreational drug use is starting to carry a stigma. But medicinal drug use is not only accepted, it's encouraged. If you're taking cocaine because you enjoy it, you're a degenerate. If you're taking cocaine because a pharmacist prescribed it for your neuralgia, you're being responsible. Pemberton's marketing genius was positioning Coca-Cola as medicine that happened to taste good, rather than a pleasant drink that happened to contain drugs. He emphasized the scientific-sounding ingredients: coca leaves from South America, cola nuts from Africa, combined using pharmaceutical precision into a brain tonic that would help you work longer, think clearer, and feel better. It sounded legitimate because by the standards of 1880s medicine, it was legitimate. The ads targeted specific groups: intellectual workers like lawyers, teachers and clerks who needed mental stamina, people suffering from nervous exhaustion, which was the catch-all diagnosis for anxiety, depression and burnout, and women suffering from female complaints, a vague term that covered everything from menstrual cramps to menopause to general unhappiness with being a woman in the 19th century. Coca-Cola, the ads suggested, could help all of them. One particularly clever marketing angle was positioning Coca-Cola as the temperance alternative to alcohol. Remember, prohibition was sweeping through southern cities, and huge portions of the population had pledged to abstain from liquor. These people still wanted something, some beverage that made socializing easier, that took the edge off a hard day, that gave them a little lift. Coca-Cola filled that void perfectly. It wasn't alcohol, so it didn't violate temperance pledges. It was sold at pharmacies, not saloons, so it was respectable, and it made you feel good in ways that water or tea simply didn't. The company even created promotional materials for churches and temperance societies, offering free samples at church socials and temperance rallies. Imagine the irony. A crowd of people who've sworn off alcohol, gathered to hear speeches about the evils of intoxication, sipping glasses of cocaine-laced cola, and feeling energized by the very drugs they're supposedly rejecting. They don't see the contradiction because cocaine isn't alcohol. It's medicine, it's science, it's progress. Pemberton and his partners also distributed thousands of coupons for free glasses of Coca-Cola, one of the earliest uses of the free sample as a marketing tactic. The strategy was simple: get people to try it once, and the cocaine would do the rest. After that first glass, customers would notice they felt better, more alert, more optimistic. They'd attribute those feelings to the tonic properties of the beverage and come back for more. They weren't getting addicted, they were maintaining their health. That's what the ads told them anyway. The advertising copy was flowery and authoritative, full of pseudo-scientific language that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Coca-Cola contains the valuable tonic and nerve stimulant properties of the coca plant and cola nuts, one ad declared. It is a delightful, exhilarating, refreshing and invigorating beverage. Notice the careful word choice: not intoxicating, not recreational, but invigorating and exhilarating. Words that suggest energy and health, rather than pleasure and vice. By 1888, just 2 years after that first sale of 9 glasses, Coca-Cola was being sold at fountains across Atlanta and starting to expand into other southern cities. The marketing worked because it spoke directly to the anxieties and desires of the era. People wanted to feel better, work harder, and stay respectable. Coca-Cola promised all three. And if that promise came with a side of cocaine? Well, nobody was complaining yet. The medicine was working exactly as advertised. By 1888, John Pemberton was dying. Stomach cancer, likely made worse by years of morphine abuse, left him bedridden and desperate for money. He began selling off pieces of his Coca-Cola formula to various business partners, trying to cash in before he died. He sold shares to at least 4 different people, creating a legal nightmare of overlapping ownership claims. Imagine dying slowly from cancer in 1888. There's no chemotherapy, no radiation, no pain management beyond morphine, which you're already addicted to and which isn't working anymore because your tolerance is too high. You're lying in bed, 57 years old but looking 70, your body wasting away, your savings gone, and the one thing you've created that might actually be valuable is a formula for a beverage that's only making modest profits. You need money. Not for investments or retirement, but for food, for rent, for morphine. So you start selling. First, Pemberton sells a share to a man named Asa Candler, a fellow pharmacist who's been watching Coca-Cola's slow but steady growth with interest. Candler pays Pemberton $250 for a third ownership stake. That's about $8,000 in today's money. Not nothing, but not nearly enough to live on for more than a few months. Pemberton takes the cash and immediately spends it on medical bills and morphine. But Pemberton doesn't stop there. He also sells shares to 2 other business partners, apparently forgetting, or not caring, that he's already sold pieces to Candler, He's desperate, dying, and the concept of exclusive rights is getting fuzzy in his morphine-clouded brain. He sells partial ownership to a man named George Lowndes. Then he sells another piece to Joseph Jacobs, the pharmacy owner who'd sold that first glass of Coca-Cola back in 1886. And to make things even messier, Pemberton's son Charlie also claims ownership of the formula, insisting his father verbally promised it to him. By mid-1888, at least 5 different people believe they own Coca-Cola, either wholly or partially. Nobody has clear legal documentation. Pemberton never bothered with proper contracts. He just scribbled agreements on scraps of paper, sometimes while high, sometimes while desperate, and always without a lawyer present. The whole situation is a legal disaster waiting to explode. Pemberton dies on August 16, 1888, probably relieved to escape the pain and chaos. He's buried in Columbus, Georgia, in an unmarked grave because his family can't afford a headstone. He dies broke despite inventing one of the most valuable formulas in history. At the time of his death, Coca-Cola is generating annual revenues of around $1,000, successful by small business standards, but nowhere near the empire it will become. After Pemberton's death, the ownership battle intensifies. Asa Candler, who's emerged as the most serious buyer, starts systematically buying out the other claimants. He tracks down George Lowndes and pays him another $300 for his share. He negotiates with the Pemberton family and pays Charlie Pemberton $500 to relinquish any claims. He corners Joseph Jacobs and offers him cash to walk away. One by one, Candler eliminates the competition, spending a total of about $2,300, roughly $75,000 in today's money, to acquire complete ownership of Coca-Cola. It's one of the most lopsided business deals in history. Candler pays less than the cost of a new car for a formula that will eventually generate billions of dollars annually. Pemberton's heirs get pennies. But here's the thing, nobody knows Coca-Cola is going to be huge. In 1888, it's just a regional soda sold at a few dozen pharmacies. It's successful, yes, but so are dozens of other patent medicines and fountain drinks. There's no reason to think Coca-Cola will be the one that survives. Except Candler sees something others don't. He sees that customers keep coming back. He sees that sales are growing steadily, not explosively, but reliably. He sees that the formula, cocaine, caffeine, sugar, and fizz creates repeat buyers in ways that other sodas don't. He understands that Pemberton stumbled onto something special, even if Pemberton himself never figured out how to capitalize on it. By 1891, Candler has consolidated all ownership claims and officially incorporates the Coca-Cola Company. Pemberton's name disappears from the advertising. The original inventor is forgotten, reduced to a historical footnote, while Candler becomes the face of the brand. It's brutal, but it's business. Pemberton had the formula, Candler had the vision, and in capitalism, vision beats invention almost every time. So John Pemberton, the morphine-addicted pharmacist who accidentally created the world's most famous beverage while trying to cure his own addiction, dies alone and broke, having sold his creation for barely enough money to pay for a decent funeral. Meanwhile, Asa Candler is about to become one of the richest men in America. History doesn't always reward the inventor. Sometimes it rewards the guy who buys low and markets aggressively. And Coca-Cola's story is a perfect depressing example of that truth. The man who truly made Coca-Cola a global phenomenon wasn't Pemberton, it was Asa Griggs Candler, a shrewd Atlanta businessman with a gift for marketing and an appetite for control. In 1888, Candler began buying up shares of Coca-Cola from Pemberton's chaotic collection of business partners. By 1891, he owned it all, for about $2,300, roughly $75,000 in today's money. Asa Candler was everything John Pemberton wasn't: organized, sober, ambitious, and ruthlessly practical. Born in 1851 in rural Georgia, Candler started as a pharmacy apprentice and worked his way up to owning his own drugstore in Atlanta. He was a devout Methodist, a teetotaler who never touched alcohol, and a businessman who believed that success came from hard work, aggressive marketing, and tight control over every detail. He was, in other words, the exact opposite of the dreamy, morphine-addicted inventor he'd just bought out. When Candler took full control of Coca-Cola in 1891, the beverage was still a modest regional product. Sales were maybe $25,000 a year, decent but not extraordinary. Candler looked at the numbers, tasted the product, and realized the formula was excellent but the business was a mess. Pemberton had been too busy chasing the next chemical experiment to worry about distribution, branding, or quality control. Candler would fix all of that. First, he standardized the formula. Under Pemberton, every batch of Coca-Cola syrup was slightly different because Pemberton mixed by feel, adjusting proportions based on intuition and whatever coca leaves happened to be available that week. Candler brought in precise measurements, documented recipes, and quality control procedures. He wanted every glass of Coca-Cola to taste exactly the same, whether you bought it in Atlanta or Birmingham or Chattanooga. Consistency was the foundation of brand loyalty. Next, he ramped up marketing in ways Pemberton never imagined. Candler believed that advertising was the single most important factor in business success, and he poured money into it, almost absurd amounts of money for a small beverage company. In 1892 alone, Candler spent over $11,000 on advertising, nearly half his total revenue. He plastered Coca-Cola ads in newspapers, on billboards, on the sides of buildings, on streetcars. He distributed free promotional items, coupons, calendars, clocks, serving trays, and even painted murals on the sides of barns across the South. The coupons were particularly genius. Candler printed millions of tickets for free glasses of Coca-Cola and distributed them through direct mail, newspapers, and traveling salesmen. The strategy was simple. Get people to try it once, and they'll come back. And it worked. Studies estimated that by the mid-1890s, 1 in 9 Americans had redeemed a free Coca-Cola coupon. That's an astonishing penetration rate for a product that was barely a decade old. Candler also expanded distribution aggressively. He hired salesmen to travel across the South, convincing pharmacy owners to install soda fountains and stock Coca-Cola syrup. He offered attractive terms, low wholesale prices, free promotional materials, and exclusive territory rights. He made it easy and profitable for pharmacies to sell Coca-Cola, and within a few years the drink was available in hundreds of locations across Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and beyond. But Candler's real brilliance was understanding the psychology of branding. He realized that Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage, it was an experience, an identity. He positioned it as the drink of modern, respectable Americans, the temperance crowd, the middle class, the upwardly mobile. He emphasized its purity, its scientific formulation, its American origins. He never mentioned the cocaine explicitly in advertising, but he didn't hide it either. It was just part of the medicinal properties that made Coca-Cola effective. By the mid-1890s, under Candler's leadership, Coca-Cola sales were exploding. Revenue grew from $25,000 in 1891 to over $150,000 by 1895. The company was profitable, expanding rapidly, and becoming a household name across the South. Candler had taken Pemberton's modest pharmacy experiment and turned it into a commercial juggernaut. And through it all, Candler maintained absolute control. He owned nearly 100% of the company's stock, made every major decision himself, and ran Coca-Cola like a personal fiefdom. He was paranoid about competitors stealing the formula, so he kept the recipe locked in a vault and personally supervised the mixing of key ingredients. He was equally paranoid about partners diluting his control, so he refused outside investors and financed expansion from profits. Candler would remain in control of Coca-Cola for nearly 30 years, building it into one of the most recognizable brands in America. But even as he succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination, one problem was quietly brewing on the horizon. That cocaine in the formula was about to become very, very illegal. And when it did, Candler would have to make a choice, reform the formula or fight the government. Spoiler alert, he tried both. If you wanted Coca-Cola in the 1890s, you didn't buy it in a bottle, you went to a soda fountain. These were the Starbucks of the 19th century, social hubs where people gathered, gossiped, and ordered custom mixed beverages from uniformed soda jerks who operated elaborate marble counters with brass fixtures and hand-pumped carbonation systems. Picture a typical pharmacy soda fountain in 1895 Atlanta. You push through the heavy wooden door and a bell jingles overhead. The interior is cool and dim, a relief from the brutal Georgia heat. The air smells like a mixture of vanilla, citrus, carbonation, and something vaguely medicinal that you can't quite identify. To your left are shelves stocked with patent medicines, pill bottles, and mysterious powders. To your right is the soda fountain. It's beautiful, almost theatrical. The counter is white marble with grey veining polished to a mirror shine. Behind it stands the soda jerk, usually a young man in his 20s, wearing a white shirt, black bow tie, and a paper cap. Behind him is the back bar, a wall of mirrors, brass fixtures, glass containers filled with brightly coloured syrups, and the carbonation apparatus, a complex system of tanks, pumps, and tubes that produces the fizzy water on demand. You approach the counter and sit on one of the wire-backed stools. The soda jerk greets you with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who's done this 1,000 times. What can I get you today? You scan the menu board behind him. Coca-Cola, 5 cents. Cherry phosphate, 5 cents. Lemon soda, 5 cents. Ice cream float, 10 cents. You order a Coca-Cola because that's why you came. You've been thinking about it all afternoon, craving that dark, fizzy drink that makes you feel sharper and more energized. The soda jerk nods and gets to work. He grabs a clean glass, about 8 ounces, and sets it on the counter. Then he reaches for the Coca-Cola syrup stored in a large glass container with a pump dispenser. He pumps once. About 1 ounce of thick, dark syrup flows into the glass. Then he pulls the carbonation lever, and cold soda water streams out with a satisfying hiss and fizz, filling the glass to the top. He stirs it briefly with a long spoon, creating a swirl of brown foam, and slides it across the marble counter toward you. You take a sip. It's cold, fizzy, sweet, and slightly bitter, with that distinctive Coca and Cola aftertaste. The carbonation tingles on your tongue. The sugar hits immediately, giving you a quick rush of energy, and then, a few minutes later, the cocaine and caffeine start working. Your mood lifts. Your thoughts feel clearer. The exhaustion you've been carrying all day recedes just a little. You don't know why it works. You just know it does. The soda fountain isn't just a place to buy drinks, it's a social institution. Men stop by after work to chat with colleagues. Women meet friends for afternoon refreshment, because unlike saloons, soda fountains are respectable spaces where ladies can gather without scandal. Teenagers come to flirt under the watchful eyes of the soda jerk who's half bartender, half chaperone. It's where you hear the local gossip debate politics, complain about the heat, and maybe, if you're lucky, strike up a conversation with that attractive person who keeps ordering the same drink you do. And everyone is drinking Coca-Cola. It's become the default order, the thing people get without thinking, the beverage that's woven into the rhythm of daily life. By the late 1890s, Coca-Cola accounts for a huge percentage of soda fountain sales across the South. Asa Candler's marketing is working. The free coupons have turned occasional drinkers into regulars, and the cocaine, subtle but present, is doing exactly what Pemberton intended. It's making people feel better, and better feelings translate to repeat business. The soda jerks themselves become minor celebrities in their communities. The good ones are skilled at conversation, remember customers' preferences, and can mix drinks with theatrical flair, pouring from a height to create maximum foam, adding a cherry or lemon twist as garnish, serving with a smile and a quip. It's customer service as performance art, and it's effective. You're not just buying a beverage, you're buying an experience. But there's a dark undercurrent beneath all this wholesome Americana, because those soda fountains where respectable people gather to drink Coca-Cola and socialize are quietly serving a mildly addictive cocaine beverage to an unsuspecting public. Nobody's calling it addiction yet. They're calling it preference or habit or just my daily Coca-Cola. But the mechanism is the same. The drink makes you feel good, so you keep coming back, and over time, you notice you don't feel quite right on days when you skip it. By 1900, there are soda fountains in nearly every American town with a pharmacy, and most of them are selling Coca-Cola. Millions of Americans are consuming small doses of cocaine regularly, legally, and happily. They don't know the storm that's coming, the moral panic, the racist legislation, the prohibition efforts that will eventually force Coca-Cola to change its formula. For now, the soda fountains are temples of innocent pleasure, and Coca-Cola is the sacrament. Pass the cocaine, please. It's only 5 cents a glass. For the first decade or so, nobody really questioned the cocaine in Coca-Cola, but by the late 1890s, America's relationship with cocaine was starting to sour. Medical journals began publishing reports of addiction, overdose, and erratic behavior. Newspapers ran sensational stories about cocaine fiends, often with deeply racist undertones, targeting black communities and stoking moral panic. You're reading the newspaper in 1900, and suddenly, cocaine is everywhere. Not the drug itself, but stories about it. Headlines scream about cocaine destroying lives, creating violent criminals, and threatening the social order. Cocaine drives man insane, one paper declares. Negro cocaine fiend attacks white woman, another shouts, with the racism barely disguised beneath a thin veneer of concern for public safety. What happened? How did cocaine go from miracle medicine to public menace in less than 2 decades? The answer is complicated and it's not pretty. Part of it was genuine medical concern. Doctors were starting to notice that patients who use cocaine regularly, whether snorted as powder, injected as solution, or consumed in beverages, were developing serious problems. Cocaine addiction was real, it was increasing, and it was causing physical and psychological damage. Medical journals published case studies, patients with destroyed nasal passages from snorting, patients with heart palpitations and seizures from overdose, patients who became paranoid, violent, and unable to function without the drug. But the bigger driver of the moral panic was race. As cocaine use spread beyond white middle-class pharmacies and into black and immigrant communities, the public narrative shifted dramatically. When white businessmen drank Coca-Cola at soda fountains, it was a harmless tonic. When black labourers used cocaine powder, it was a dangerous narcotic that turned them into violent criminals. This wasn't subtle. Newspapers explicitly linked cocaine use to racial fears, publishing lurid stories about black men high on cocaine committing assaults, robberies, and worse. These stories were often fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but they served a political purpose. In the post-Reconstruction South, white supremacist politicians were desperately trying to reassert control over black communities through Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and violence. Cocaine became a convenient excuse. If black men were using cocaine and becoming violent, or if people could be convinced that's what was happening, then aggressive policing, disenfranchisement, and even lynching could be justified as necessary for public safety. One particularly infamous article, published in 1914 by a doctor named Edward Huntington Williams, claimed that cocaine gave black men superhuman strength, made them immune to pain, and fueled sexual assaults against white women. The article was pure racist propaganda, unsupported by any actual evidence, but it was widely reprinted and cited as fact by lawmakers pushing for cocaine prohibition. Williams even claimed that police had to switch to larger caliber bullets because cocaine-crazed black men couldn't be stopped with standard ammunition. It was absurd, hateful, and effective. Southern states began passing laws restricting cocaine sales, often explicitly targeting black communities. Some laws made it illegal to sell cocaine to Negroes specifically while allowing sales to whites. Pharmacies in black neighborhoods were raided. Black cocaine users were arrested and given harsh sentences, while white users were often ignored or sent to private sanitariums for treatment. The double standard was blatant and intentional. At the same time, the temperance movement was gaining strength, and reformers who'd successfully targeted alcohol were looking for their next crusade. Cocaine was an obvious target. It was a stimulant, it was habit-forming, and it was associated, rightly or wrongly, with vice, crime, and moral decay. Progressive activists, church groups, and women's organizations began lobbying for federal regulation of cocaine and other drugs, arguing that the government had a duty to protect citizens from dangerous substances. By the early 1900s, cocaine's reputation was in freefall. What had been celebrated as a wonder drug in 1885 was now condemned as a scourge in 1905. Medical opinion shifted. Doctors who'd once prescribed cocaine freely now warned patients away from it. Pharmacists who'd stocked it openly now kept it behind the counter or refused to sell it altogether. And companies like Coca-Cola, which had built their brands on cocaine-containing formulas, suddenly faced a very uncomfortable question. What do we do now? Asa Candler saw the writing on the wall. He understood that cocaine was becoming politically toxic, that continued use could turn Coca-Cola from a beloved temperance beverage into a scandalous drug delivery system. But he also understood that removing the cocaine entirely might change the formula in ways that alienated loyal customers. He needed to thread a very narrow needle. Keep the name Coca-Cola, keep the coca leaf connection for marketing purposes, but eliminate enough cocaine to avoid legal trouble and public backlash. The controversy was building, the laws were tightening, and Coca-Cola was about to face its first existential crisis. The question wasn't whether the formula would change, it was how much, how quickly, and whether anyone would notice. Spoiler alert, they noticed. It's impossible to talk about cocaine prohibition without acknowledging the racism baked into it. As cocaine use spread beyond white middle-class pharmacies and into black and immigrant communities, the tone of media coverage shifted dramatically. Suddenly, cocaine wasn't a harmless pick-me-up. It was a dangerous narcotic that made black men violent, uncontrollable, and dangerous to white women. Let's be crystal clear about what happened here, because this isn't subtle history. It's overt, documented, shameless racism that directly shaped American drug policy for the next century. In the 1880s and 90s, when cocaine was primarily used by white doctors, pharmacists, and middle-class customers, it was celebrated in medical journals, sold openly at pharmacies, and marketed as a respectable health tonic. Nobody was calling for bans. Nobody was warning about addiction epidemics. It was fine. But by the early 1900s, cocaine powder was increasingly available in black communities across the South, particularly among labourers, dock workers, and railroad construction crews. Some employers even gave cocaine to black workers to increase productivity during long shifts, essentially using it as a performance-enhancing drug for grueling physical labour. And as use increased in these communities, white newspapers and politicians began a deliberate campaign of fear-mongering that was as transparent as it was vicious. The most infamous example is probably the 1914 article by Dr. Christopher Koch, published in Literary Digest, which claimed that most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of the cocaine-crazed Negro brain. This wasn't presented as opinion, it was presented as medical fact, written by a doctor, published in a respected magazine. Other articles claimed that cocaine made black men immune to bullets, gave them superhuman strength, and eliminated their natural fear of white authority. One Southern sheriff was quoted saying he'd had to upgrade to .45 caliber bullets because his .38 couldn't stop cocaine users. None of this was true, none of it was based on actual evidence, but it was repeated constantly, amplified by newspapers, cited by politicians, and used to justify increasingly harsh drug laws. The racism wasn't just in the rhetoric, it was in the enforcement. Southern states began passing laws specifically targeting cocaine sales in black neighborhoods, while leaving white pharmacies largely untouched. Some states made it illegal to sell cocaine to black people specifically, while allowing continued sales to whites. Police raids focused overwhelmingly on black-owned businesses and black communities. Arrest rates for cocaine possession were wildly disproportionate, with black defendants receiving far harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offences. And this wasn't just Southern racism, it was national policy. When Congress debated drug regulation in the early 1900s, many of the most influential voices supporting cocaine restrictions explicitly cited the threat to white women and the need to control black populations. One congressman from Georgia argued that cocaine was turning peaceful, law-abiding black citizens into dangerous criminals who threatened white communities. Another claimed that cocaine prohibition was necessary to prevent race riots and maintain social order, by which he meant maintaining white supremacy. The link between cocaine prohibition and Jim Crow laws wasn't coincidental, it was intentional. This was the era of massive black disenfranchisement across the South, when states were passing literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses designed to prevent black voting. It was the era of widespread lynching, with thousands of black men murdered by white mobs, often on fabricated accusations. And cocaine prohibition fit perfectly into this broader project of control and oppression. If you could convince white voters that black men on cocaine were a threat to public safety, you could justify almost any level of police violence, legal discrimination, or political suppression. The saddest part is how effective this propaganda was. By 1910, most white Americans, including many who considered themselves progressive and enlightened, genuinely believed that cocaine was particularly dangerous in black hands. They believed the stories about superhuman strength, immunity to bullets, and violent rampages. They believed that prohibition was necessary for public safety, not recognizing, or not caring, that the entire moral panic was built on racist lies designed to justify oppression. And Coca-Cola found itself caught in the middle. The company had built its brand on cocaine-containing cola, marketed primarily to white middle-class Southern customers, the exact demographic that was now being told cocaine was a dangerous drug associated with black criminality. Asa Candler understood that continuing to advertise the cocaine content would increasingly alienate his core customers, but removing it entirely might seem like an admission that Coca-Cola had been dangerous all along. So the company did what corporations always do when faced with a moral crisis. They quietly changed the formula while pretending nothing had changed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, the government had to step in and force the issue, and that's exactly what happened in 1906, when Congress passed a law that would change American food and drug regulation forever. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a horrifying exposé of the meatpacking industry that made America collectively gag. Public outrage forced Congress to act, and the result was the Pure Food and Drug Act, a groundbreaking law that required companies to list their ingredients on labels. For the first time, patent medicine makers had to admit what was actually in their bottles. Imagine you're a consumer in 1905. You walk into a pharmacy and see rows of patent medicines, each one making grand promises: cure tuberculosis, eliminate kidney disease, restore lost manhood. The labels are beautifully designed, featuring ornate lettering, testimonials from satisfied customers, and authoritative-sounding medical claims. What they don't feature is an ingredient list. You have absolutely no idea what's in that bottle. It could be water and sugar, it could be alcohol and cocaine, it could be mercury and opium. You're expected to trust the manufacturer, and since there's no regulation, manufacturers can put whatever they want in there and say whatever they want about it. This system worked great for companies. They could make fortunes selling useless or even dangerous products, but it was terrible for consumers. People died from mercury poisoning because their kidney tonic was actually toxic. Children became addicted to opiates because their teething syrup contained morphine. And nobody could do anything about it because there were no laws requiring honesty in labelling or safety in formulation. Then Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, and everything changed. Sinclair was a socialist muckraker trying to expose the horrific working conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants. His book described immigrant workers being exploited, injured, and killed in factories that processed meat for American consumers. But what really grabbed public attention wasn't the human suffering, it was the descriptions of how meat was processed. Rats falling into grinding machines, workers with tuberculosis coughing over open vats, spoiled meat being chemically treated to mask the smell and sold as fresh. America read these passages and collectively lost its appetite. President Theodore Roosevelt, who'd read the book and was genuinely horrified, ordered an investigation. The report confirmed Sinclair's descriptions, and worse, public pressure mounted. Newspapers ran daily exposés about unsafe food. Women's groups organized boycotts. And Congress, which had been ignoring food safety reform for years, suddenly couldn't ignore it anymore. The result was two landmark laws passed in June 1906. The Meat Inspection Act, which regulated slaughterhouses, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which regulated everything else. The Pure Food and Drug Act was revolutionary. It created the Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the Food and Drug Administration, and gave it authority to regulate food and drugs. Most importantly, it required manufacturers to list certain ingredients on labels, specifically including alcohol, opiates, cocaine, and cannabis. For Coca-Cola, this was a problem. The company had spent 20 years carefully avoiding the question of exactly how much cocaine was in each bottle. The marketing emphasized coca leaves and medicinal properties without providing specifics. Now, suddenly, the government was requiring disclosure. Coca-Cola would have to print on every label exactly how much cocaine it contained, and customers would be able to see it, compare it to other products, and make informed decisions. Asa Candler panicked. He understood immediately that listing cocaine on the label would be a public relations disaster. The moral panic around cocaine was intensifying. Newspapers were running daily stories about cocaine addiction. Southern states were passing restrictive laws, and Coca-Cola's customer base, respectable, middle-class, temperance-supporting families, was increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that their favorite beverage contained the same drug associated with crime and vice. Candler had actually seen this coming and had already started modifying the formula. By 1903, the company had switched from fresh coca leaves to spent coca leaves, leaves that had already been processed to extract most of their cocaine for pharmaceutical use. These spent leaves still contained trace amounts of cocaine, but far less than the original formula. A glass of Coca-Cola in 1903 contained maybe 0.2 milligrams of cocaine instead of the 1.8 milligrams from the 1890s. That's a 90% reduction, but it wasn't zero. The company argued that such tiny amounts shouldn't count, that they were medically insignificant, that requiring labelling would unfairly stigmatise a safe, wholesome beverage. But the law was clear. If it contained cocaine, it had to be labelled. So Coca-Cola faced a choice: remove the cocaine entirely, or print contains cocaine on every bottle and watch sales collapse. They chose a third option: fight. In 1909, the federal government seized 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and charged the company with violating the Pure Food and Drug Act. The case became known as United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, which sounds like the title of a legal comedy, but was actually a deadly serious battle over whether Coca-Cola could continue selling a cocaine-containing beverage without clear labelling. The trial would drag on for years, involve dueling expert witnesses, and generate thousands of pages of testimony about caffeine, cocaine, and what exactly pure food meant. But the message was clear. The days of selling unlabelled cocaine beverages were over. Coca-Cola could adapt or die. And Asa Candler, whatever his faults, was a survivor. He'd already started quietly reformulating the drink, reducing cocaine content to near zero, while loudly insisting nothing had changed. It was the beginning of Coca-Cola's long, awkward relationship with regulatory agencies, a relationship that continues to this day. Faced with new regulations and growing public scrutiny, Coca-Cola quietly began altering its formula. By 1903, the company had switched from fresh coca leaves to spent leaves. Coca leaves that had already been processed to extract most of their cocaine for pharmaceutical use. The leftover leaves still contained trace amounts of cocaine, but far less than the original recipe. Here's how it worked, and it's both clever and legally questionable. Pharmaceutical companies like Merck were importing massive quantities of coca leaves from South America to extract pure cocaine for medical use, legitimate medical use, like local anesthetics for surgery. After the extraction process, they were left with huge piles of spent leaves that still retained the coca flavour, the natural oils, and tiny, almost negligible amounts of cocaine, maybe 0.02% instead of the original 0.7%. Asa Candler made a deal with these pharmaceutical suppliers. Coca-Cola would buy the spent leaves at a fraction of the cost of fresh leaves, process them into extract, and continue claiming their beverage contained coca leaf extract, which was technically true, even though the cocaine content had been reduced by over 95%. It was a brilliant business move. The company saved money on ingredients, dramatically reduced the cocaine content to levels that were medically insignificant, and could still market Coca-Cola as containing the exotic South American coca that had always been part of its identity. But Coca-Cola never announced this change. There were no press releases, no advertising campaigns explaining the new formula, no transparency whatsoever. The company simply started using spent leaves and hoped nobody would notice, and for the most part, nobody did. Customers who'd been drinking Coca-Cola for years might have noticed a slightly different taste. Maybe a bit less bitter, maybe a touch less of that numbing sensation on the tongue, but the differences were subtle enough that most people attributed them to normal variation between batches or fountains. The secrecy was intentional. Candler understood that admitting the formula had changed would raise uncomfortable questions. If the cocaine was being reduced, did that mean it had been dangerous before? If the new formula worked just as well without cocaine, had the cocaine been unnecessary all along? If customers learned that Coca-Cola was reformulating to avoid legal trouble, would they lose trust in the brand? Better to say nothing, change everything, and pretend the beverage had always been exactly as it was now. There was another problem: the name. Coca-Cola explicitly referenced coca leaves. If the cocaine was gone, could they still call it Coca-Cola? Legally, probably not. But changing the name would destroy decades of brand recognition and marketing investment. So, Coca-Cola threaded the needle. They kept buying coca leaves, spent leaves, but still coca, and kept extracting flavouring from them, allowing the company to truthfully claim the beverage still contained coca extract. The cocaine was effectively gone, but the coca remained, at least nominally. This created a bizarre situation that continues to this day. Coca-Cola still uses coca leaves in its formula, purchased from a single supplier licensed by the DEA to import them. The The leaves are processed by a chemical company in New Jersey called Stepan Company, which extracts all the cocaine, which is then sold to pharmaceutical companies for medical use, and ships the decocainized coca extract to Coca-Cola. So yes, Coca-Cola still contains coca. No, it doesn't contain cocaine, at least not in amounts that could be detected by modern lab tests. It's a legal and chemical technicality that allows the company to maintain naming rights and marketing heritage, while completely eliminating the drug that made the original formula work. But back in 1903, when the formula change first happened, none of this was clear to consumers or regulators. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced more transparency, but Coca-Cola remained vague about exact cocaine levels, arguing that trade secret protections meant they didn't have to disclose precise formulations. The government disagreed, which is how we ended up with one of the strangest legal cases in American history. Interestingly, some loyal customers did notice the change and complained. Letters to the company from 1904 through 1908 occasionally mention that Coca-Cola doesn't work as well as it used to, or doesn't give me the same lift. The company's response was always some version of, "You must have gotten a bad batch or your soda fountain isn't mixing it correctly." They never ever admitted that the formula had been altered. That admission wouldn't come until decades later, long after everyone involved was dead, and cocaine prohibition was so entrenched that nobody seriously believed Coca-Cola should bring it back. The formula change also marked a subtle shift in Coca-Cola's identity. In the 1880s and 90s, it had been a medicinal tonic that happened to taste good. By the 1910s, it was becoming a refreshing beverage that happened to have medicinal origins. The cocaine, which had been central to Pemberton's vision, was being quietly written out of the story. And the company was betting, correctly, as it turned out, that customers cared more about taste, branding, and habit than they did about the specific chemical composition of their favourite drink. Still, the cocaine didn't disappear overnight. Even with spent leaves, trace amounts remained in Coca-Cola well into the 1920s. It wasn't until around 1929 that the company finally perfected a process for completely removing all cocaine from the coca extract. By that point, cocaine had been fully illegal for nearly a decade. The moral panic had reached fever pitch, and nobody was asking Coca-Cola to bring back the original formula. The transition was complete. Coca-Cola had survived by adapting secretly and gradually, until the drug that gave it life was nothing but a historical footnote. Even after removing most of the cocaine, Coca-Cola couldn't shake the controversy. In 1909, the federal government seized 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup in Chattanooga, Tennessee, charging the company with violating the Pure Food and Drug Act. The case became known as United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. Picture the scene: federal agents storming a Chattanooga warehouse, seizing barrels of thick, dark syrup, and officially accusing one of America's fastest-growing beverage companies of poisoning the public. It sounds dramatic because it was dramatic. This wasn't a quiet regulatory dispute settled in back rooms. This was a full-blown federal prosecution, complete with newspaper headlines, courtroom drama, and expert witnesses testifying about the dangers of caffeine and cocaine. The government's case was actually focused more on caffeine than cocaine, which tells you something about how confusing and inconsistent early drug regulation was. By 1909, Coca-Cola had already reduced its cocaine content to near zero using spent leaves, so prosecutors couldn't really argue the beverage was flooding America with cocaine. Instead, they argued that caffeine was an added and therefore adulterated ingredient that made Coca-Cola dangerous, especially for children. The legal theory was technical. The Pure Food and Drug Act prohibited adulterated foods, which the government interpreted as foods containing added substances that were harmful or deceptive. Prosecutors argued that caffeine was harmful, causing insomnia, nervousness, and heart palpitations, and that adding it to a beverage marketed as healthy was therefore illegal adulteration. They brought forward witnesses, parents whose children had become addicted to Coca-Cola, doctors who claimed caffeine was poisonous, and chemists who testified about caffeine's effects on the nervous system. Coca-Cola's defense was equally aggressive. The company hired top lawyers and its own expert witnesses who testified that caffeine was harmless in moderate doses, that it occurred naturally in tea and coffee without causing problems, and that Coca-Cola contained less caffeine per serving than a cup of coffee. They argued that caffeine wasn't added in the legal sense because it came from cola nuts, which were a natural ingredient listed right in the product's name. They positioned the prosecution as government overreach, an attack on a successful American business by bureaucrats who didn't understand chemistry or commerce. The trial took place in Chattanooga in March 1911 and lasted a month. It was a media circus. Newspapers across the country covered it daily, often with sensational headlines. Government claims Coca-Cola is poison. Coca-Cola fights for survival. The company's reputation was on the line, and so was Asa Candler's fortune. If Coca-Cola lost, they'd have to reformulate again, possibly removing the cola nuts and caffeine entirely, which might destroy the taste and the brand. The evidence presented was wild by modern standards. The government brought in a psychologist who'd conducted experiments on students, giving them Coca-Cola and then testing their cognitive abilities. He claimed the caffeine made them jittery and impaired their judgment, though his methodology was questionable at best. Coca-Cola countered with its own studies showing that moderate caffeine consumption improved focus and productivity. Both sides cherry-picked data, exaggerated findings, and generally engaged in what we'd now call scientific propaganda. There was also testimony about the cocaine, even though it was barely present in the formula anymore. Prosecutors tried to argue that any amount of cocaine, no matter how small, made Coca-Cola dangerous and illegal. Coca-Cola's lawyers countered that the cocaine levels were so low, less than 1/50th of a medicinal dose, that they had no pharmacological effect whatsoever. One defense witness testified that you'd have to drink multiple gallons of Coca-Cola in a single sitting to feel any cocaine effects, and by that point, the sugar and carbonation would have already killed you. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict that satisfied nobody. Coca-Cola was found guilty of selling an adulterated beverage, but the verdict was so narrow and technical that it didn't actually force the company to change anything. The judge fined Coca-Cola and ordered them to remove the offending syrup from the market, but allowed them to continue manufacturing and selling as long as they properly labelled the caffeine content. It was a split decision, a legal and public relations mess that neither side could claim as a clear victory. Coca-Cola immediately appealed, and the case dragged on for years through higher courts. In 1916, the Supreme Court finally weighed in, ruling that the government had to prove that caffeine was actually harmful, not just that it was an added ingredient. The case was sent back to district court for retrial, but by that point, everyone was exhausted. The government and Coca-Cola eventually reached a settlement. Coca-Cola agreed to reduce its caffeine content slightly and improve its labelling, and the government agreed to drop the prosecution. The whole affair cost Coca-Cola a fortune in legal fees and damaged its reputation, but the company survived. And it learned valuable lessons about managing regulatory risk, controlling the public narrative, and maintaining political relationships. Asa Candler realised that fighting the government was expensive and dangerous. It was better to quietly comply, make the minimum necessary changes, and invest in lobbying and public relations to prevent future attacks. That strategy would serve Coca-Cola well for the next century, but the message was clear. The era of completely unregulated patent medicines and beverages was over. Companies like Coca-Cola could no longer operate in the shadows, changing formulas without transparency, making medical claims without evidence, or ignoring concerns about dangerous ingredients. The government was watching now, and while Coca-Cola had dodged the bullet this time, the bullet was still flying. Cocaine might be gone, but the scrutiny would never fully disappear. With cocaine mostly out of the picture, the government shifted its focus to Coca-Cola's other stimulant, caffeine. Federal prosecutors argued that caffeine was a dangerous habit-forming drug that was harming children. The case dragged on for years, involving expert witnesses, dramatic courtroom testimony, and scientific studies about whether caffeine was actually harmful. By 1910, cocaine had been so thoroughly demonized that nobody seriously defended its inclusion in beverages. But caffeine? That was different. Caffeine was in coffee, tea, chocolate, and dozens of popular soft drinks. It was consumed daily by millions of Americans, from grandmothers sipping tea to factory workers drinking coffee, to stay alert during long shifts. If the government succeeded in classifying caffeine as a dangerous adulterant, the implications would stretch far beyond Coca-Cola. That's why the Coca-Cola case mattered so much. It wasn't just about one beverage company, it was about establishing legal precedent for how America would regulate stimulants in food and drinks. And the government, emboldened by recent progressive reforms and the success of the Pure Food and Drug Act, decided to make caffeine its test case. The government's argument went something like this: caffeine is a drug. It affects the central nervous system, alters mood and behaviour, and can cause dependence. When added to soft drinks marketed to children, it creates young addicts who crave Coca-Cola not because it tastes good, but because their bodies need the caffeine. This is deceptive, harmful, and violates the spirit of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was meant to protect consumers from dangerous additives. They brought forward witnesses to support this narrative. Parents testified that their children drank Coca-Cola obsessively, becoming irritable and anxious when they couldn't have it. Teachers claimed students who consumed Coca-Cola before school were jittery, distracted, and unable to focus. Doctors testified that caffeine was particularly dangerous for young, developing brains. One particularly dramatic witness, a mother from Tennessee, tearfully described how her daughter had suffered nervous collapse after drinking Coca-Cola daily for 6 months, though she conveniently ignored the fact that the girl had also been under severe stress from other sources. The government even commissioned studies. They gave Coca-Cola to laboratory animals, mostly rabbits and dogs, and monitored their behaviour. The animals became more active, sometimes agitated, and showed elevated heart rates. The prosecutors presented this as evidence that Coca-Cola was dangerous. The defence pointed out that giving a rabbit the human equivalent of 3 gallons of Coca-Cola and then acting shocked when it freaked out wasn't exactly rigorous science, but the damage was done. The headlines wrote themselves: "Government study shows Coca-Cola harms animals." Coca-Cola's defence strategy was two-pronged. First, they argued that caffeine wasn't added in the legal sense because it came naturally from cola nuts, which were explicitly listed in the product name. Coca-Cola wasn't sneaking caffeine into an innocent beverage. It was extracting caffeine from a natural botanical ingredient that had been part of the formula from day one. If the government wanted to ban caffeine, they'd have to ban cola nuts entirely, which would be arbitrary and unreasonable. Second, they argued that caffeine was safe in moderate doses. They brought forward their own expert witnesses, doctors, chemists, and pharmacologists, who testified that caffeine had been consumed safely by humans for centuries. Coffee drinkers weren't dropping dead. Tea drinkers weren't suffering mass addiction epidemics, and the amount of caffeine in a glass of Coca-Cola, roughly 34 milligrams, was significantly less than a cup of coffee, which contained 80 to 100 milligrams. Coca-Cola also commissioned its own studies, though these were about as scientifically rigorous as the government's rabbit experiments. They gave Coca-Cola to college students and then tested their cognitive abilities, reaction times, and mood. Surprise. The students performed slightly better after drinking Coca-Cola, suggesting that caffeine improved mental function rather than impairing it. The company published these findings in friendly medical journals and cited them extensively during the trial. The courtroom battle became a war of competing studies, cherry-picked data, and dueling experts. For every government witness claiming caffeine was harmful, Coca-Cola produced a witness claiming it was beneficial. For every parent testifying about their addicted child, Coca-Cola found a parent praising the beverage for helping their child stay alert during studying. It was less about truth and more about who could be more convincing. What's striking about this case is how little it actually had to do with public health, and how much it had to do with politics, economics, and cultural anxiety. The government wasn't prosecuting coffee companies or tea importers, even though those products contained far more caffeine. They were targeting Coca-Cola specifically because it was new, enormously successful, and marketed to children. There was a vague cultural discomfort with the idea of kids drinking stimulant-laced sodas, even though those same kids often drank coffee at breakfast without anyone batting an eye. Asa Candler understood this. He knew the case wasn't really about caffeine, it was about control, about a government trying to establish its regulatory authority over a rapidly growing industry. So he fought back not just with science, but with politics. Coca-Cola hired lobbyists, courted sympathetic congressmen, and launched a public relations campaign emphasizing the company's southern roots, its job creation, and its role as a wholesome American success story. The strategy worked. By the time the case finally settled in 1918 after years of appeals, the government had essentially given up on proving caffeine was dangerous. Coca-Cola agreed to slightly reduce caffeine levels and improve labeling, but they didn't have to remove caffeine or admit any wrongdoing. It was a corporate victory disguised as a compromise. But the fight left scars. Coca-Cola had learned that regulatory agencies could threaten the company's existence, that scientific claims could be weaponized in courtrooms, and that public perception mattered as much as legal facts. The company invested heavily in lobbying, public relations, and building political relationships to ensure they'd never be this vulnerable again. And it worked. To this day, caffeine remains in Coca-Cola, legally and uncontroversially, the last surviving stimulant from Pemberton's original formula. The cocaine is gone, but the buzz remains. For years, Coca-Cola was only available at soda fountains, mixed fresh, served in glasses, consumed on the spot. But in 1899, two Chattanooga lawyers named Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead had an idea. What if you could bottle Coca-Cola and sell it anywhere? They approached Asa Candler with the proposal, and he essentially gave them the bottling rights for free. This sounds insane from a modern business perspective. Candler was sitting on one of the fastest-growing beverage brands in America, and he gave away the bottling rights, arguably the most valuable part of the business, for $1. $1? It's consistently ranked as one of the worst business decisions in corporate history. So why did he do it? The answer is that Candler didn't believe in bottling. He was a soda fountain guy through and through. He'd built Coca-Cola's success through fountains, and he genuinely believed that Coca-Cola could only be properly enjoyed when freshly mixed at a marble counter by a trained soda jerk. Bottling, in his mind, was inferior. The carbonation would be weaker, the formula might separate, the taste would suffer. And there was a class issue too. Soda fountains were respectable middle-class establishments. Bottled beverages were working class, sold in grocery stores, and consumed on the street by labourers. Candler wanted Coca-Cola to maintain its upscale image. Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead saw things differently. They recognized that most Americans didn't have easy access to soda fountains. People living in rural areas, small towns, or working-class urban neighborhoods couldn't casually drop by a pharmacy for a Coca-Cola. But if the beverage could be bottled and distributed through grocery stores, general stores, and even street vendors, the potential market would explode. They offered to handle all the bottling, distribution, and associated costs themselves. Candler would just provide the syrup. He'd have zero financial risk and could focus on the fountain business he loved. Candler thought about it for approximately 5 minutes and said yes. He signed a contract in 1899 giving Thomas and Whitehead perpetual rights to bottle Coca-Cola across most of the United States for a fixed price per gallon of syrup. The contract was absurdly generous to the bottlers. No territorial restrictions worth mentioning, no performance requirements, and no ability for Candler to renegotiate or reclaim the rights. It was a legal disaster for Coca-Cola and a goldmine for Thomas and Whitehead. At first, bottling was difficult and unprofitable. The technology was primitive. Bottles were hand-filled, hand-capped, and inconsistently carbonated. They leaked. They exploded. They went flat within days. The taste varied wildly depending on who mixed the syrup and how much carbonation they added, and distribution was a nightmare. Bottles were heavy, fragile, and expensive to ship. Thomas and Whitehead spent the first few years losing money, and Candler felt vindicated in his skepticism. But they persisted. They improved the bottling technology, investing in better carbonation equipment and quality control processes. They experimented with different bottle sizes and shapes. They developed a distribution network of local bottling plants across the country, each one independently owned but operating under the Coca-Cola name. And slowly, bottled Coca-Cola started catching on. The breakthrough came in rural and working-class markets, exactly as Thomas and Whitehead had predicted. Farmers could buy Coca-Cola at the general store and drink it in the fields. Factory workers could grab a bottle during lunch breaks. Families could keep a few bottles at home for hot summer evenings. The convenience was undeniable, and the 5-cent price point, same as the fountain price, made it accessible to almost everyone. By 1910, bottled Coca-Cola sales were exploding, rapidly approaching fountain sales in volume. Candler watched in horror as the bottlers got rich off a contract he'd signed without thinking. He tried to renegotiate, arguing that the original agreement was unfair and that he deserved a larger share of bottling profits. The bottlers, quite reasonably, told him to go pound sand. They had a legal contract, and they weren't giving it up. This created a bizarre corporate structure that persisted for decades. The Coca-Cola company controlled the syrup production and fountain business, while independent bottlers controlled the much larger bottled beverage business. The two sides were legally and financially separate, often with conflicting interests. Bottlers wanted cheap syrup and freedom to price and market as they saw fit. The Coca-Cola company wanted quality control, consistent branding, and a bigger cut of the profits. They fought constantly. Candler never forgave himself for the bottling contract. He tried multiple times to buy back the rights, or force the bottlers into a new agreement, but the bottlers held firm. They knew they had the better deal, and they weren't letting go. It wasn't until 1919, when Candler finally sold the Coca-Cola company to a group of investors led by Ernest Woodruff, that the new owners began slowly negotiating better terms with the bottling network. But the damage was done, or the success was established, depending on your perspective. By 1920, Coca-Cola was available in bottles across America, from New York to California, in cities and tiny rural towns. The bottling decision, which Candler had dismissed as unimportant, had transformed Coca-Cola from a regional fountain drink into a national brand. Sometimes the worst business decisions turn out to be the best accidents, and sometimes you give away $1 billion industry for $1 because you can't imagine people wanting to drink soda from a bottle. History is full of expensive lessons. By 1915, Coca-Cola had a problem. Imitators. Dozens of copycat colas flooded the market with names like Coca-Nola, Toca-Cola and Coca-Cola, packaged in bottles that looked nearly identical to Coca-Cola's straight-sided glass. The company needed something distinctive, a bottle so unique you could recognize it in the dark, or even if it was broken. The imitation problem was serious. By the 1910s, Coca-Cola's success had spawned an entire industry of knockoffs. These weren't legitimate competitors creating their own brands, they were shameless copycats trying to trick customers into buying an inferior product by using confusingly similar names and packaging. Store shelves were filled with brown, fizzy colas in clear glass bottles, and unless you read the label carefully, which most customers didn't, you couldn't tell them apart. Coca-Cola sued repeatedly, but trademark law in the early 20th century was weak and inconsistent. Companies could often get away with blatant copying as long as they changed a letter or two. Coca-Cola wasn't technically Coca-Cola, so some judges ruled it wasn't infringement. Meanwhile, customers who'd meant to buy Coca-Cola were accidentally purchasing knockoffs and then complaining that Coca-Cola didn't taste as good anymore, damaging the brand's reputation. The Coca-Cola company realized they needed a solution that didn't rely on courts, a bottle so distinctive that even if knockoff brands tried to copy it, customers would immediately recognize the real thing. In 1915, they sent a challenge to their bottlers. Design a bottle that's instantly recognizable, even in the dark, even if it's broken. The prize? The contract to supply that bottle to the entire Coca-Cola bottling network. Several bottling companies submitted designs. The winner came from the Root Glass Company in Terre Haute, Indiana. The story goes that a designer named Earl Dean and his team went to the local library to research coca leaves and cola nuts, hoping for inspiration. They couldn't find information about coca plants, but they did find an illustration of a cacao pod, the source of chocolate, not the source of cola nuts, meaning their research was technically wrong. But the illustration showed an oblong pod with vertical ridges, and Dean thought, what if we made a bottle shaped like that? The result was the contour bottle, a curvy feminine silhouette with a narrow waist, fluted ridges running vertically, and a distinctive bulge at the bottom. It looked unlike any other bottle on the market. You could hold it in the dark and know immediately it was Coca-Cola. You could see a broken piece on the ground and recognize the curve. And perhaps most importantly, it was difficult to imitate. The shape was so unusual that knockoff companies couldn't replicate it without obviously copying. The bottle was also functional. The narrow waist made it comfortable to grip even with one hand. The ridges provided texture that prevented slipping, and the curves had a subtle psychological effect. The bottle felt special, premium, like something designed with care rather than mass-produced cheaply. Customers noticed. They liked it. Some even collected the bottles. Coca-Cola patented the design and began rolling it out nationwide in 1916. It wasn't an instant universal switch. Existing bottlers had huge inventories of straight-sided bottles they needed to use up first, but within a few years the contour bottle had become the standard. And it worked exactly as intended. Imitators couldn't copy the shape without violating the patent, and even after the patent expired, the contour bottle was so associated with Coca-Cola that using it felt like admitting you were a knockoff. The bottle became iconic in ways the company never expected. During World War II, American soldiers serving overseas requested Coca-Cola, and the distinctive contour bottle became a symbol of home. Artists started incorporating it into paintings and sculptures. Andy Warhol famously said, "You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coca-Cola, Liz Taylor drinks Coca-Cola, and just think, you can drink Coca-Cola too. The bottle represented democracy, accessibility, Americana. By the mid-20th century, the contour bottle was so recognizable that Coca-Cola could run advertisements showing just the silhouette. No words, no labels, and everyone knew what it was. That's the power of distinctive design. It transcends language and becomes a cultural symbol. The bottle wasn't just packaging anymore, it was the brand. In 1960, Coca-Cola took the unprecedented step of trademarking the bottle shape itself, arguing that the contour design had become so associated with the brand that it deserved legal protection beyond the expired patent. The US Patent Office agreed, making the Coca-Cola bottle one of the few packages ever granted trademark status. You couldn't make a bottle that looked like that without Coca-Cola's permission, even if you were selling something completely different. Today, the original glass contour bottle isn't used as much. Plastic bottles and aluminum cans dominate for practical reasons. But Coca-Cola still produces glass contour bottles for certain markets and special editions, and the shape is echoed in the plastic bottle designs, maintaining that distinctive curve even in modern materials. It's one of the most successful examples of packaging design in history, solving a business problem while accidentally creating an icon. All because some designer in Indiana misread a library book about chocolate and decided to make a bottle shaped like a cacao pod. Sometimes the best designs come from happy accidents and research mistakes, and sometimes a bottle becomes more famous than the liquid inside. So tonight, as you sink into your clean bed with climate control and indoor plumbing, maybe spare a thought for John Pemberton, the morphine-addicted pharmacist who accidentally created a global empire while trying to cure his own pain, a man who mixed cocaine and cola nuts in a brass kettle, sold his formula for pocket change, and died broke while his creation went on to conquer the world. Think about the strange journey we've traced tonight, from a Civil War saber wound to a soda fountain in Atlanta, from 1886 pharmacy experiments to 21st century global dominance. We've watched cocaine go from miracle cure to criminal narcotic in less than 4 decades. We've seen a beverage survive prohibition, world wars, regulatory battles, and its own scandalous origins to become the most recognized brand on planet Earth. We've met the characters. Pemberton, brilliant and broken, mixing chemicals in his backyard while fighting demons he couldn't escape. Asa Candler, shrewd and sober, who bought a formula for $2,000 and built it into an empire. The bottlers who saw potential where Candler saw only risk. The government agents who seized barrels of syrup and debated whether caffeine was poison. The soldiers who drank Coca-Cola in trenches and jungles, turning a beverage into a symbol of home. And we've uncovered the contradictions. A temperance drink that contained cocaine, a brain tonic marketed to children, a secret formula that probably isn't that secret, a company that spent a century erasing its own history while simultaneously profiting from the mystique of that history. A beverage that survived by changing everything while pretending nothing changed. The story of Coca-Cola is, in many ways, the story of America itself. Ambitious, opportunistic, occasionally hypocritical, and ultimately successful beyond anyone's wildest imagination. It's a story about how capitalism adapts to survive, how marketing can transform scandal into legend, and how something as simple as sugar water and bubbles can become a cultural touchstone recognized in every corner of the globe. It's also a reminder that history is rarely simple or comfortable. The things we love often have complicated origins. The brands we trust were built by flawed people making morally ambiguous decisions, and the line between medicine and vice, between acceptable and criminal, between respectable and scandalous, that line moves constantly, drawn and redrawn by politics, racism, economics, and moral panic. Pemberton thought he was creating medicine. He was actually creating an icon. He thought cocaine was the solution to his morphine problem. It became the scandal his creation would spend a century escaping. He died believing he'd failed. He had no idea he'd started something that would outlive empires, survive wars, and reach literally billions of people across generations. There's something beautiful in that, even if it's also slightly tragic. Because innovation rarely looks like innovation at the time. It looks like desperation, experimentation, and mistakes that accidentally work. Pemberton was just trying to survive, to make rent, to quiet the pain. He mixed some leaves and nuts in a kettle, added sugar and fizz, and stumbled into history. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary struggles. Sometimes a broken man with a morphine habit and a brass kettle can change the world, not through grand vision but through stubborn persistence and a willingness to mix things that probably shouldn't be mixed. So as you drift off tonight, remember that the ordinary is often extraordinary, that scandal can become legend, and that somewhere in a vault, or maybe just in our collective imagination, there's a secret formula that's less about ingredients and more about the story we tell ourselves about those ingredients. Coca-Cola literally contained cocaine, and that's the boring part. The interesting part is everything that came after. The survival, the adaptation, the global conquest, and the way a beverage became something more than liquid in a bottle. It became memory, culture, identity, and proof that sometimes history's strangest chapters are also its most successful. Sleep well. Dream of soda fountains and pharmacists, of a time when medicine was whatever made you feel better, and nobody asked too many questions. Dream of brass kettles and cocaine leaves, of 5-cent glasses and secret formulas, of empires built on bubbles and branding. And when you wake up tomorrow and reach for whatever beverage you prefer, whether it's coffee, tea, water, or yes, even Coca-Cola, remember that it probably has a story too. Maybe not as wild as cocaine and pharmacists, but a story nonetheless. Because everything we consume, everything we touch, everything we take for granted came from somewhere, created by someone, shaped by forces we rarely stop to consider. History isn't just dates and battles and presidents. History is also about the morphine-addicted pharmacist who tried to cure himself and accidentally created the world's most famous drink. It's about the racist legislation that transformed a legal stimulant into a criminal substance. It's about the businessman who gave away bottling rights for $1. It's about the soldiers who carried Coca-Cola to every continent and made it a symbol of home. History is weird, messy, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating when you dig beneath the surface. And tonight we've dug deep into one small corner of that history, the corner where medicine meets capitalism, where scandal becomes legend, and where cocaine becomes Coca-Cola. So here's to John Pemberton, who never saw his creation success. Here's to the cocaine that launched an empire and then disappeared without ceremony. Here's to the lies, the adaptations, the reformulations, and the brilliant marketing that turned a questionable beginning into a respectable legacy. And here's to you for listening to this strange tale of bubbles, drugs, and capitalism. May your sleep be deep, your dreams be peaceful, and your beverages be exactly as advertised. Good night, and remember, some of history's biggest empires started in the most unlikely places, like a backyard in Atlanta with a morphine addict, a brass kettle, and a very questionable idea. Sweet dreams.